Joining us on our panel talking about financial cost of climate change is Andy Stevenson, an environmental advisor for Volo Foundation. Britt Groosman, Vice President of Global Climate at the Environmental Defense Fund, and Trenton Allen, Managing Director and CEO for Sustainable Capital Advisors. Trenton, I'm going to start with you. With this question, and you get to tell a little bit about yourself as well, you've brought together investment bankers, financial advisors, nonprofit managers, and engineers to form Sustainable Capital Advisors. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how it relates to the changes that our environment is going through right now.
Thank you, and thank you to the Volo Foundation and UCF for allowing me to speak today. This topic really capsulizes sort of why we were formed. Really was to think about how do we fund the future. I had a background in financing utility projects, some even in this particular state, particularly natural gas, coal. Worked on the next stage of nuclear projects, and out of my career about 15 years ago, one of the things we realized is that how we were procuring electricity, how we were developing projects would change. And we needed to adapt to that. We need to think about how we need to use less energy, how we need to have it sited closer to population centers, how it needs to be more resilient, more reliable, and all those things that are now taken for granted, but about 15 years ago, people were saying, why in the world would you ever think about that? So really, I brought a team together, really think about the future. How do you finance the future? And for us, it's really sustainable infrastructure. We're based in Washington, D.C., really around the idea of how do we bring innovative capital solutions into the market for sustainable infrastructure projects. And for us, that's energy, water, transportation, agriculture, and the built environment. And we spend a large part of our time in the marketplace working with organizations, whether they be developers, governments, investors, to form these particular types of transactions and structure and how to get activity on the ground. And so when the president was talking about action, that's a lot what we spend our time on. And so really, when we think about sort of what we do and where we spend a lot of our time, is really sort of how do we create more projects on the ground? How do we identify financial risk? How do we identify, how do we eliminate barriers for capital coming into the marketplace such that we can create more opportunities, more projects that reduce carbon and fossil fuel usage, but also think about sort of how we are transitioning to a carbon-free society.
Great, thank you so much. Andrew, earlier this year, you, along with Volo Foundation, published a breakthrough report called Climate Risk Ranking Report. Can you share a little bit about who you are and how you composed that report, as well as some of the top, how some of the top oil and gas companies and the people who choose to invest in them will be affected by the rising cost of climate change?
Sure. Is there a slide portion? Do we know if there's something coming up?
That's where it would be.
Let's see if there is one.
Or glitter.
I'm hoping for the...
It is Pride weekend.
Oh, there we go. Oh, I'm going to go back one. Sorry. Maybe not. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so before I begin on the climate risk work that we did with respect to the oil and gas companies, I wanted to start with just an understanding of who is currently paying for climate change and where those costs are being distributed. And as you can see from this graph below, this is a graph of all kind of natural loss disasters over the last several decades. There's a huge gap that exists between that which is insured, which is the blue line, the blue line, and the dark blue line, and the light blue line, which is the total amount of disasters that actually take place. So as you can see from this graph, not only has climate change created significant amount of losses to the, in general, those losses have not been concentrated in just businesses. Those have been basically collectively lost by everyone on the planet. And this trend is likely to continue. In terms of what we did, so what we did for this analysis of the oil and gas industry, those are, if you look at that previous chart, those are the people that are actually at risk, which is everyone in this room in terms of the costs of climate change. In terms of how to solve these problems, some industries have to do more work than others, and we wanted to do a deep dive on the oil and gas industry to see just how really at risk they are and what possible ways are for them to solve this problem for all of us. In terms of what actually needs to happen for the oil and gas industry, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but you can see that the current path of oil and gas consumption is really not is sort of at odds with what needs to be done in order to keep climate change at least mitigated to the 2-degree scenario that the Paris Accord is currently looking for. So the oil industry needs to see reductions in demand and natural gas as well. And that can actually have a huge impact on the cash flows of those companies themselves. So what does that mean if demand falls? That means that the amount of oil that they're selling falls, and ultimately means that they are going to have less profitable projects going forward. In terms of the value of those projects, they're pretty substantial. So currently we're looking, they currently have about $2 trillion worth of projects in terms of value. That could fall anywhere between $300 billion and significantly more, up to $1.3 or $1.4 trillion over time if demand falls in line with what needs to be done to meet our climate goals. And so the most important part of the analysis that we did is, okay, well, these industries have, they have choice. They can actually invest in these projects or not over time. But what really is the binding thing with respect to these companies is that they have a lot of debt. And so when you have a lot of debt, you have to pay back your share, you have to pay back those bonds over time. And if you have very long debt, it's very hard to explain how you're going to pay that back in a world where climate is actually going to be front and center of the issue. So if you can see from this chart at the very end, there are something along the lines of $30 billion worth of debt where companies have borrowed for a very, very long period of time. And over that very long period of time, the ability for them to produce oil and gas at the same rate that they are today, the business as usual case, is very unlikely. And so that's sort of the idea that we're focused on in the report, and is really would be the driver of what kind of ultimately would slow down the production. And I'll just finish with this in terms of the risk factors. The last one is how the oil and gas industry, the perception is the oil and gas industry is on this roller coaster ride and we're all on it and we can't avoid getting off. But if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, sort of the most important graph that I can show you in terms of the outputs, is that because oil over time is, the production goes down over time, so you have an oil field, it produces a lot of oil, then over time it goes back down again. The amount of oil that we actually need, even under a very low carbon scenario, which keeps us in line with the 2 degrees warming limit, we still are, the oil and gas companies still are not actually on track to produce that much. So over time, they continually invest in new projects, but if they actually had to slow down that new project investment, they would not actually be that encumbered by a reduction in climate change, reductions in production associated with climate change. So basically the takeaway point is that we still have an opportunity, even in the oil and gas industry, to meet our climate goals over time, just by allowing a lot of the decline rate in production to go down.
Great, thank you. So Britt, you are by training an economist, which I'm really thrilled about because you're going to help us segue into the next part of our conversation. It puts you at a distinct advantage to tell us how climate change is affecting the economies of other countries. So can you tell us the good and the bad, because I'm assuming there is possibly some good, and could you also touch on pollution tax, which you authored in the Encyclopedia of Law and Economics? That's a lot, I know.
Yeah, I might not touch upon all of that, but yes, I am an economist, have worked on air pollution and climate issues for 25 years, which is a very long time. The good and the bad, well, the good is that as an economist, I have been studying for a long time how humans and economies make choices about where we allocate our labor, our sort of social capital. That's basically the definition of what economics is. It studies how we make choices. And we can be influenced. We can make choices in a positive way for the environment, or we can make it in a negative way. And one of the reasons why we've made choices that have always been very good for the environment is that so far, pollution and environmental issues have pretty much been unpriced, right? So if you go to a shop and you buy a good, you're not going to leave the shop without paying. You have to pay for that good that you've just taken. When we pollute, often we do it without any cost at all. And therefore, it doesn't come into our minds when we're making a decision about how we use our resources. The good and the bad. So the bad is that because of this unpriced nature of pollution, for a very long time, economies have been able to grow their GDP and their labor force basically at a cost to the environment. However, the good is that it's very possible to grow your economy without having to have this detrimental cost. So one of the, I think, the fallacies is that, we can't afford to combat climate change, combat air pollution, because it will cost us jobs, it will cost this and that. There's been many examples in the world where it's shown that that's just not true. I mean, David showed a great slide earlier of an example in Sweden, where you very clearly see what we call the sort of decoupling of economic growth and climate action. And basically you see that there is sort of a decline in pollution, and yet there's a massive growth in the economy and jobs, because there is a lot of jobs in the new infrastructure that's needed. There's a lot of jobs in the new way of creating energy, new way of creating transport. There's a lot of innovation that's required, and that will require capital. So the venture capitalists are ready. It will require labor. It will require all our minds in a very sort of positive way. So actually, I'm very optimistic. I'm also a mother, so I have to be. So, not just doing this for ourselves.
Right. And what you're bringing up is a discussion about what do we value in the world, and how do we place the value on it, and possibly how do we develop a new bottom line. In a presentation I do, it's called The Weight of Carbon Dioxide and Chihuahuas, where I'm looking at the weights, the various weights of carbon dioxide and fossil fuels on us, and not just the physical weight of it, but the moral, the financial, the justice-related weights. So there are new ways that we're looking at our pollution and at climate change. So how, can you define, any of you on the panel, through your own experience, what really is the cost of climate change? What are measurements that you're looking at beyond just the financial? I mean, we can look obviously at the financial cost, but in addition, how are you measuring these costs?
Well, I was going to mention just the hurricane cost in general. So just as the public cost. So let's just talk about what the taxpayer paid last year for climate change. So we paid about $133 billion in relief for natural disaster event, natural loss events, and that's more than the Department of Education and Homeland Security combined. So in terms of our actual cost as a taxpayer, very significant. Last year, we also forgave FEMA $16 billion from their flood program. So FEMA was basically bankrupt last year, and we forgave them $16 billion, so now they're solvent again. So in terms of the costs that we pay as taxpayers, so money that comes out of our pockets, it's very immediate for us as Americans.
I think, obviously, that as an economist, any cost can be put into a financial cost, even human suffering. But putting that aside for a minute, human suffering cost is huge. There's national security risks, even though in Washington, D.C. right now, there's a tendency to not believe in climate change. If you speak to the military, they are actively preparing for what it means. Ministry of Defense really very much believes it is an issue. It's going to be an issue of immigration, it's going to be an issue of water scarcity, and that's going to become a real factor for social unrest. So, I mean, it really can't be understated. On a very micro level, until a year and a half ago, I lived in Brazil. One day a week, we didn't have water because there was water scarcity, and so they would just switch off the water at the mains one way a week to make us save water. So the effects are very widespread, from our daily life to what we'll see to where we plan to buy a house, whether we can still insure that house, in Florida, et cetera, to really the huge political and society questions like immigration and just and national security. So that's the negative bit. Can't be understated, I think.
And I would just add to it, I mean, one of the clients that we work with is the U.S. Virgin Islands, who last year got hit by 2 hurricanes. The first one hit St. Thomas and St. John's. As they relocated to St. Croix to try to rebuild, St. Croix got hit in the second hurricane. And so one of the challenges that we immediately faced with working with the utility was thinking, one, let's try to get everything restored as quickly as we possibly could. But quickly we realized from the financial side, and this is the cost from our standpoint, was what happens when we have 100% electricity up, but the people aren't there? Can they pay? When are the businesses coming back? When are jobs available? And so we started to take a look at it, not just from the standpoint of our client, which was the utility, and thinking through what their costs were, but thinking about the full economic cost of the islands. When would they come back to the islands? When would people come from tourism? It was tourism season. What does that do to the overall tax base? And so as we start to spin out from just micro looking at the utility about bringing electricity back on, we start to recognize that how intertwined all the different industries and systems are within that particular islands, and recognizing that we have to come up with a better solution that thinks about resiliency, not just from a physical standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. And in some respects, from the standpoint of the central government there, that was the biggest concern, was thinking through how do they harden their tax base in a way such that they did not have to rely upon the federal government to provide funding, so that there wasn't an argument in the legislature that held up funding that was much needed to provide aid to people that were on the ground. And so those are some of the things that I think about when we think through sort of the effects of climate change, is the upheaval in people's lives that will never be the same. And can we do things in both small and large actions that could really start to address those in meaningful ways?
Well, as you mentioned that, it gives me hope, because what you're talking about is climate change is something other than simply an environmental issue. Like when David put up that slide which showed what people are concerned with, Republicans and Democrats, environmental issues were very low, but they're very concerned with national security, immigration, jobs. These are all climate issues.
Absolutely.
And having that discussion and helping people see, no, you already have skin in the game. You care about things that are affected by climate change. That helps broaden this discussion. But people are very anxiously looking for possible solutions to decarbonize the economy. And there was a time that cap and trade was talked about a lot, but now the discussion is going more to carbon pricing, carbon taxes, carbon fee and dividends. We've seen some successes in Sweden, in British Columbia, but we've also seen resistance to it. Could you talk a little bit about carbon pricing, carbon taxing, the pros and the cons? Who do you see are the natural people to want to come on board, and where's some of the opposition coming from, and how does it work as a solution?
Sure. Okay, we start. So there, as you described, there are 2 systems, sort of a carbon tax and a cap and trade system, right? And so the benefit of a cap and trade system is the cap part. You know, people focused on the trade part, but the cap part is what really is important, which is driving down emissions over time. So a carbon tax attempts to get at the same end result, but it's a little less definitive in terms of those industries aren't responsible for a certain emission reduction over time. But it is probably the most practical way to go forward on this issue, and it is helping people pay as they go for those services. So if you're consuming more, you are paying more. So it is sort of fair in that way. If you look at the gas task, for example, even though it's underfunded, it is designed to pay for the roads. Right, so that's an important thing, that people drive more are actually paying for it. So you end up with a much more of an equitable distribution.
This is a topic I could talk about for hours. So
Oh, good. I love this topic.
So I agree with everything my colleague said, and there are in a sort of, as an economist in a lab, when you're doing modeling, carbon tax and cap and trade are exactly the same thing, because they will lead to a sort of ultimate equilibrium where the tax will be exactly the same price as the allowance in a cap and trade system. The world's not a lab. The world is not an economic model. The nice thing about cap and trade, the essential thing about cap and trade is that it sets that cap, which is led by science. So I have tremendous respect for Catherine Hayhoe and her colleagues who are the real scientists and who can sort of say, look, if we don't get below this level of emissions, this is not going to end well. And that's really where policymakers, and I kind of put myself in that box as I try to work with policymakers, we need to take our cue from. You know, what is it that needs to get done? We're not doing a cap and trade or a policy just for fun. We're doing it for a reason, a scientific reason. So if you put that up front, so there is two systems. The difficulty with the tax is that you're basically trying to get to the cap through the back door. You're basically estimating what should the level of the tax be to get us the emission reductions we want. And then it becomes a political haggle about who will accept this tax at this level. Now, cap and trade is a political haggle as well, so, you know, it's not one is easier than the other. It is true that at the moment, it's definitely in the US, there is more appetite for a tax than there is for a cap and trade system, although the cap and trade system in California is extremely successful, has been adopted by states in Canada, is being watched by China, which wants to replicate the system. It's being watched by Mexico, which is looking to replicate the system. But in the current sort of very bipartisan level in the US, we have a couple of bills on the floor, including one by a Florida senator, that are mainly looking at tax, and they're doing exactly what you're saying. They're not calling it an environmental tax, they're calling it an infrastructure tax, or they're calling it, so they're looking at how can we politically sell this to our voters, and that's kind of the tax and dividend, where you tax for the environmental reasons, but then you say to your voters, look, we're going to be using the money to build the roads, we're going to be using the money to do the flood defense, etc. So that's all about political appetite, really.
And all things said were spot on. I think from my perspective, it's less about the mechanism, all right, and really what you're trying to do. And so from my standpoint, how I look at this is really the greatest importance of either a carbon tax or cap and trade or some other type of arrangement in between is really how do we stimulate increased demand for clean energy activity. Right? So that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do. So can we send enough market clues to utilities and or others to undertake certain levels of activity? And if whatever mechanism you choose or is most politically palatable to get through, then go for it. Because really that's what we're looking for. We're looking for increased demand, both from at the consumer level, sort of what I consider sort of this bottom-up approach, sort of retail customers, sort of all of us in this room individually, but also from other organizations and actors, such as utilities or others who are procuring energy in large quantities. And so if we can get both of those right, then I think we have a chance to really sort of combat this. Thinking about it only as a tool that deals with top-down in the sense of thinking through utilities is one way, but I think is inadequate and incomplete. And so we need to think about the policies that we enact as a way that generates demand for clean energy activities, sustainability activities throughout the spectrum, not just in one particular sector. That's the fear that I have when we get into the conversations about cap and trade, carbon tax, that we are limiting only into certain sectors where we may not end up with the perfect solution. And just given where our politics are today, you get one bite at it and it's done, and we've got something that's not quite fully sufficient for the problem that we have.
But that's why, just very quickly, for instance, in California, they've been very successful in broadening the system to, I think, 85% of their economy.
Yes.
They've even included transportation,
Yes.
which is very rare. Like in the EU, transportation's not in there. So I hear you, and yes, it's possible.
Yes. Correct. And California's a unique place. Not like most of this country. And I think it'd take, to do that, to have a broad, entire system-based policy on carbon will take leadership. And I hope that during the course of the elections, this one and the next one, that some leaders rise up or dust themselves off, or somewhere some of you all emerge that can tackle this and tackle it in a broad-based way that needs to happen. So I hope that we can do that through our leadership.
I heard the word equity come up a few times, and in the US in particular, when a carbon tax was put forward, surprisingly, it was some of the more progressive environmentalists who took issue with it. And the issue is about who is going to pay more and how will it affect them, because poorer middle-class folks pay a larger percentage of their income towards energy and all the other food stuff that will be, the prices will go up on and everything. So like with climate change, we're all in the same boat together, we're just not all on the same deck. And so it's possible we can create a solution that is technically makes, decarbonizes, but it puts other people at greater risk. So if we were to put a price on carbon, where should that money go in a way that is equitable, that could actually make households come out ahead and not suffer more and create more poverty and struggling financially?
For example, in the cap and trade bill that did not get passed in the United States, but I was involved in with Senator in 2009, 2008, 2009, there was a portion of those monies went back to poor people, people with lesser income. So it was actually thought through in the cap and trade program, and I think a lot of the carbon tax discussions also include rebates to people that are kind of lower income, in the lower income strata.
I think absolutely it's a big issue, and my answer to it is twofold. On the one hand, yes, there are many ways in which, whether they're tax revenues or cap and trade revenues, can be redistributed. That's one thing. Secondly, utility prices tend to be regulated. It's not like the utilities can just increase their prices as much as they can. So that's another way to stop what we call fuel poverty. And thirdly, I do have to say that I do think a lot of the gloom and doom about, oh my God, prices are going to shoot up through the sky are overestimates and are basically there to sort of threaten people to not vote for these changes. And anytime we've seen an environmental legislation brought in and the costs were estimated by people like me, economists who don't have a crystal ball and who always underestimate technology, we always overestimate the costs, and it always ends up being much cheaper than we thought. So yes, there are ways to compensate for it, and I think we can do it a lot cheaper than we think we can.
I think, quite honestly, we just need to be intentional about it, right? So if at the core what we're trying to do is to ensure that there is an equitable approach to any climate solutions, carbon cap and trade, carbon tax, then we need to be intentionally mindful of the policies and the structures that are going to impact particularly low-income, our low-income neighbors. For instance, right, so many states have system benefit charges, right, that are collected on utility bill and used to provide energy efficiency and or solar for customers, right? But that provides some level of incentive or rebates or some other type of incentives to incentivize some activity. But there's a gap, right? So there's a gap that exists. So maybe the incentives provide 30% of the cost. However, the customer needs to come up for 70%. While that says that, well, some will say, well, that incentive is available to all customers, low income and middle income and higher income customers. Truth of the matter is, many of the low income customers still don't have access to finance or capital to bridge that gap. So while, yes, you have provided an incentive that can be targeted, you still have not recognized that there is a gap in the financial markets of what products are available. And so I think that when we think about sort of providing capital through rebates and grants or other incentives, that we should be mindful of those gaps that still exist in our financial structure that impede the ability for low-income customers to access the market to fund that particular gap. And if these are projects that save, whether they might be energy efficiency or solar, depending on which state you're in, then we need to come up with structures that do that. Community solar and some other types of technologies or structures are ways to get at that. But I just want to just say that, it's not enough to just put the money in the rebate and in the incentive. We need to also think through how do we fund the gap, because that is such a critical piece of of one of the areas where we've seen across the country of low-income customers not being able to access the very incentives that they're paying for.
Have something you wanted to add? No. Well, I want to turn it to you all if you have questions for any of our panelists, for the panel in general about this financial cost of climate change. So I'll give you a moment to think about that. Giada has microphones going around. We ask you to use the mics because this is being recorded and we want to make sure your question is recorded. We have a hand over here and I have a hand over here. So we'll start, their mic's closer here, so we'll start there and we'll come over here.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name is Clayton Farrar. I'm a biologist. And, you know, between this presentation and a couple of the slides that were shown before about where environmentalism ranks in people's, cares, how can we help to change that using this data? For instance, it seems so overwhelming, the connection between climate change and the economy, but yet people aren't making that kind of connection. What do we do about that?
Well, I would start with what has happened in other environmental areas that have been incredibly successful in trying to leverage that. If you look at air pollution, for example, in the United States, and what happened with the Clean Air Act, I mean, we couldn't look across the street in New York City, where I have been working for a very long time. In the 70s, there was garbage running down the river, along the East River in those days. And over the course of a 40-year period, the Clean Air Act has done some remarkable things. And always, the costs have always been a concern and always railed at by the industry. But if you look at the numbers over the last 50 years, the Clean Air Act has saved 10 million American lives. You've avoided 50 million asthma attacks that affect children, obviously, and old people as well, and avoided over 1 billion lost workdays. So it's an incredibly successful program where the costs were in the order of about $40 billion a year, and the actual impacts were along the lines of $1.4 trillion a year in terms of health impacts. So it's trying to relate these things to successful programs that have happened over a very long time, and I think that is sort of, even those numbers are known by about 8 people. So it's actually getting that information out there, and I think that that's a very valuable way to start and say, look, this has happened for a very long period of time, talking about avoided costs, but Superman would be hard pressed to have saved 10 million people. So it's a pretty heroic effort on the part of the EPA.
And we have a question over here.
Yes, my name's Tom Larson from Jacksonville with Self-Help Credit Union. We talked about spreading funds around from a possible fee or tax or trade and dividend. When we do that, do we end up picking winners and losers in any way, or should we be a little more intent on pathways, opening pathways? For instance, funding a significant increase in electric vehicle charging stations, which was one of my issues this morning, finding the stations here on campus, or how do we transform the incorporation of energy efficiency, which pays so well, or solar energy prospects distributed across the community? Should we focus those funds into the really transformative or innovative or multiplicative innovation?
I think, like most things, there isn't one solution. I think you need to create a portfolio of options with different ranges, right? So I think you need to have some funds or monies available for immediate needs, right? So if there are immediate increases or shocks that are to customers who have particularly lower margin for error, and those are our low-income neighbors, then we should figure out ways to identify opportunities that exist there. Now that might be through, particularly programs tied to energy efficiency or solar or whatever it might be, water conservation, that may also help reduce the bill, but I think there's pathways there. There should also be some funds that are directed towards technology breakthroughs, right? So we shouldn't just think about just what's available today, we should also think about what is available in the future. That's a longer range goal and may have a longer range impact, but we need to make sure that we're also mindful of that as well. And then there are some midterm things that sort of correct around, you just mentioned electric vehicles and having enough charging stations. That is definitely one of it, but also think about sort of all the policies around that as it pertains to how we are, development, how we are developing neighborhoods or different communities where we're putting charging stations, how prevalent are they, who's getting access, what type of business models are tied to those particular charging stations. So I think that we should need to be spending time on all those things, not just one. It's not a one-size-fits-all for any of this. But I think, as we think about what the solutions would be in Florida will be different than what they would be in Mississippi. And so each state will have to try to figure out what's the right mix of things that works for them. But I think it is a combination of some short, mid-range, and longer-term opportunities tied to whatever funds that may come available. And once again, I'll just say, to me, it's less about that funding, but more about creating the demand, because the demand that we need to create far outstrips any revenue we're going to raise from the cap and trade or carbon tax. We need significantly more than that. So anything that we can do to stir demand, I think is incredibly important.
Anything else any of you wanted to add to that question? All right. I have a hand here and a hand there. So we'll go there first, and then oh, you have the mic already.
So I have the microphone, so I'll give it to whoever the next hand is. But my name is Emily Doviditis, and I'm a graduate student here at UCF. And as a student, I recognize that I'm in a really sort of privileged position to have access to all of these great databases for free through, well, I'm paying for it, but through the library. And not only that, but I have access to professors and experts and administrators who care and kind of help me navigate that information, and a lot of information on climate change and climate science and the financial costs associated with it can be quite dense and difficult if you don't have someone who will translate it for you into a more kind of like palatable and digestible like tidbits. And so when it comes to geophysical information, like the carbon emissions and things like that, I know that NASA has a really wonderful climate science website, and anybody who I encounter that's kind of denying climate change or doesn't believe me and needs to look at the numbers, I kind of pull up that website or send them news articles and things. But admittedly, I don't have a similar website for the more like social and economic sides of climate change. So I was wondering if any of you have a website in mind or an easily accessible piece of information that translates these social and financial costs quite well, and they're all in sort of one place.
I'll take that really quickly. So I work for the Environmental Defense Fund, and we do have a website with a couple of really good blogs. We also have our climate scientist who's actually preparing a sort of huge database now with all accessible data, bring them all into one place, because right now you have to look at all these different websites. And unfortunately, a lot of data that was on the EPA website has vanished. And so she's brought that all back in. There was a lot of scientists who kind of scrubbed behind doors before that happened. So unfortunately, when it comes to explaining things to people who don't want to believe in climate change, I think quite often it's a case of they will not believe it until it comes to their door, until they are the ones who don't have water that week, or until they are in a hurricane, etc. Unfortunately, in this country right now, there's a political rhetoric where it's like you're either in or out. I'm not quite sure how much facts we can throw at that. We've been told behind closed doors that there's a lot of senators, a lot of people on the Hill who are totally believe in the issue but can't vote for the issue right now because so we just need to keep working on finding those champions in providing the data. But in terms of your actual question, I would go to our website. There's a lot of other great environmental that have great databases on that.
And I'm grateful you asked this question because it's really important in the work that I do as a performance artist and a public speaker. I'm not an environmentalist, and I'm not a scientist, and I want to reach the public who they're not moved by charts and graphs. My partner, he's originally from South Africa, and he was part of the anti-apartheid struggle, and he said the older generation said to him in the 90s, he said, we knew when the artist got involved, that's when we were going to win. And climate change and all this data, really what needs to happen is there needs to be some crowdsourcing where artists get involved and help the public understand what it all means. And so anytime you have the opportunity to present a paper, to do a dissertation, see about the possibility of partnering with an artist and ask that artist to produce some art around this scholarship, because we're a narrative people. And if you go to most websites, there are very few faces of people, very few narratives, but it's stories that move people so often. And so part of it is how you communicate and who's sharing. So share that information with artists, and I think we'll see more people getting closer to it because it will make more sense to them and what it means for them. We have a question over here.
Is that on?
You're on.
I would say my question kind of segues into the two conversations you've had. How do we influence the super majors of the world, the BPs, the Chevrons, the Exxons, that have a lot of capital? They have the brain power to be innovative, but how do we influence or create a catalyst for them to want to deploy the capital in a way out of drilling and other, damaging sources of providing fuel to us? How do we get there? Legislation, grassroots, any thoughts?
Don't look to me. You're the experts here.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I mean, the oil and gas industry is very much a demand-driven industry, and the United States has found like an incredible amount of money under the ground over the last 10 years because of fracking. It's just it's gone from being just a fantasy that we would be energy, and self-sufficient, and now we are, right, over a very short period of time. So getting to them is more about getting to the automotive industry, and actually working on the demand side of the equation. So you're talking about, electric vehicles, obviously that has a huge impact, as well as, automated cars, for example, has a huge impact on what would likely be demand for oil because of the efficiencies, the less of a need for transporting single people and single cars all the time, which is really what we're doing, in the United States and elsewhere. So it's really hard to get to them from an investment standpoint. I mean, if you look at what they do, they buy back a lot of their stock, for example, which to me means that they don't even want to look at other opportunities, right? They just like, let's just create this. We have this great ATM machine. Let's just keep working with the ATM machine, which just prints money. So I think it's really more on the demand side that needs to be the focus, and that can be policy driven with things like clean vehicles and other options, but it's really going to come down to that.
It's a great question, and I think we need both the grassroots and the top-down legislation. You need the grassroots for the politicians to have the audacity and the bravery to actually implement the legislation that is required, that will give the big companies that, right, they're serious, this has going to change. And then absolutely it's going to come through the demand side, and it's a demand side in a global world. When China says cars have to be this and this efficient or they don't come into our market, everybody looks up. It doesn't matter what in the US the current administration might want to say, oh no, you don't have to have cars that are as efficient. The car manufacturers here are looking at farther than that. So it's a global international trade world, and that's where you want to look. But you definitely want to have the grassroots. I want to give a shout out for my colleague who's here from Defend Our Future. Talk to the millennials. They have got to support this. They have got to give their representatives the confidence that they will vote for the issue. So it's both.
And I'll just wrap it up in a way that they sort of said, but in my own personal way. I wouldn't even try, just me personally. Sorry. and the reason, and it goes back to exactly what was said, just I'm just wrapping it up in my own way. They have other concerns, right? They have their own businesses to run and their own concerns about their own shareholders and their business and what they're doing and their investments and their capital and all this other stuff. And this is not one of them. So I don't really worry about them. But I go back to everything I was just said about the demand, right? So in my career, when I first started, we built lots of power plants, right? And we signed and we did 30-year bond transactions, right? To fund billions of dollars worth of transactions, right? Predicated under one belief, that basically a customer within that service territory did not have a choice and would always buy electricity from that utility. Is that the case today? What's changed? Policies? Yeah, policies change. Costs have changed. Technology has changed, right? So I can live in a state that doesn't have net metering. I can still decide that solar is a really cool thing and can save me money. And maybe I can go find some storage, right? And depending on my income, I might be able to find somebody to help fund this, right? So there's things that have happened with regards to the world that I grew up in that's completely changed, that doesn't have anything to do with about policy. And it comes back to this question about demand, right? So demand by customers who are looking for something that they can change, that they can either save money on or has a better fit with what their values are. And so I think the idea about really, especially this generation, younger generation, a little younger than me, thinking about sort of how do you utilize your power in a sense to making sure that you are making decisions about what you invest in, what you purchase, that are aligned with the values that you have is incredibly important. And to stimulate that and to support that as a way to really move people, and even if they don't move people, they'll move the market. And moving the market will allow people who have capital to figure out how to make sure that they're part of that as well. So that's just the reason why I don't really concern about that, because I think that there's so much more power in other areas. So.
We're about to go to a break, so real quickie.
Yeah, two things. A lot of it is policy, though. The fact that I can now buy electricity from a green utility in New York City, where I live currently, is because the market's deregulated. This happened in Europe many years ago. All the utilities were monopolies. As you said, you can build whatever filthy power plant because people had no alternatives. They were going to buy electricity from you. Deregulation has changed that, and that's a big policy decision. And the other thing is, the big oil companies are looking at this. When I was working as a sort of pure economist, so not yet an environmental economist, in 1994 I was working for BP on energy. I had to sign like a non-disclosure that I wasn't going to talk about that project because they didn't want people to know they were even looking at it, because that would have made them seem like they were already switching. Anyway, demand side, I think, is where you want to go.
Sorry, let me just have one more thing. All right, so this is good now. We're having a conversation. All right. So correct that in deregulated markets that did have an impact, but we're also seeing increases in solar and other technologies in marketplaces where they aren't deregulated, right? So we still see improvements in the Southeast and parts of the Midwest that are where the policy and regulatory framework aren't quite as friendly for, sort of these types of technologies are still sprouting up even without that policy framework in place.
And as someone analyzing the room, I see an increased need for a break, which we're going to have a 10-minute break, but please give it up for our panelists, Trenton, Andrew, and Britt. Thank you so much.